Zero to hero in 30 minutes. I'm Jason Maynard. I'm a senior multi-domain architect focused on cybersecurity. All right, a shift from the old model where everything was inside a network and it can communicate and devices were trusted by default. And when I say devices, I'm talking about assets that include humans and the devices or machine-based devices like a printer. Then the business challenged this model with mobile devices, cloud-based services, and in fact, COVID really started to push the boundaries. The approach of inside equals good and outside equals bad was never a great model to start with and certainly doesn't work in today's world. So what is zero trust? Well, it depends. And it depends on your perspective and your needs. And in many cases, regardless of who you talk to, they're probably right in what they're saying in regards to zero trust. But we know the old model, everything talked to everything once inside the environment. And so you had a perimeter that would defend the inside, and by default it was trusted. By the outside, again by default, it was untrusted. And you had things like next-gen firewall and IPSs and spam. And then the explosion of devices has certainly made it very difficult to control everything. And then vendors. Vendors have seen the opportunity here with the term zero trust. And now they're marketing their products, get 10% more zero trust. Or if you buy our product, you get zero trust. And this has led to confusion. We all know that zero trust is not a product, but we've seen it marketed as such. So vendor A, as an example, core principles to zero trust. Examine all default controls, preventative techniques that touch on identity, data, and application. You got real-time monitoring of malicious activity, alignment of the broader security strategy. Vendor B, verify explicitly, use least privileged access, assume breach. And vendor C says network segmentation, next generation firewall. You got virtualized next-gen firewall, user identity, application identity. And so is this really a roadmap towards zero trust, or are we now leveraging technologies or capabilities and saying here's the zero trust outcome from those capabilities? It's probably more in line with that. You're not going to buy a single product that's going to achieve 100% zero trust. It may complement and drive towards it, but it certainly will not provide a 100% zero trust model. And so you've got things that are missing here, and certainly it's marketed towards the strengths of the vendor that's selling the idea around their products in zero trust. But if we look at zero trust at Wikipedia, what is it? So zero trust model or zero trust architecture, zero trust network architecture, ZTA, ZTNA, maybe perimeterless security, describes what zero trust or the security model is, right? So it's a single source of user identity, user authentication, machine authentication, additional context such as policy, compliance, and device health, and authorization policies to access an application, and access control policies within an application. Okay, so we've got an idea of what zero trust is, but let's look at NIST. NIST 800-207 specifies specifically that it's not a single architecture, nor is it a product, but a set of guiding principles for workflow, system design, and operations that can be used to improve the security posture of any classification or sensitivity level. And so it outlines exactly what is required to drive towards zero trust. So all data sources and computing services are now considered resources. Okay. You got all communication is secure regardless of network location. Understood. Access to individual enterprise resources is granted on a per session basis. Okay, that's something different that we may not do holistically within an environment. Access to resources is determined by dynamic policy, including observable state of client identity application service and the requesting asset, and may include other behavioral or environmental attributes. Okay, well, I can tell you in a lot of environments we're not doing that. We're not dynamically building policy based on identity, the application or service that you're connecting to, and the behavioral attributes or environmental attributes that might be happening at the time. That's something we certainly need to improve on. The enterprise monitors and measures the integrity and security posture of all owned and associated assets. And then you've got all resources, authentication, and authorizations are dynamic and strictly enforced before access is allowed. The enterprise collects as much information as possible of the current state of assets, network infrastructure, and communication, and uses it to improve security posture. So these are the principles that are required to drive towards zero trust. Then you have Forrester, Zero Trust Extended. You have Gartner with Continuous Adaptive Risk and Trust Assessment. At the end of the day, many people are focused on 800-207 and using these principles to drive towards their zero trust outcomes. So COVID-19 certainly has accelerated the adoption of zero trust. And so if you look at it, I've Googled this, zero trust and COVID, you can see all the things here. Zero trust is a security framework that eliminates the concept of trust. You've got data security and COVID-19, why a zero trust environment is critical. An ebook that talks about the era of COVID-19 and zero trust. You got 5 minutes, the importance of zero trust. 60% of organizations have accelerated zero trust. And it goes on. At the end of the day, we have seen an increase in adoption, and it's really focused on that hybrid workforce or the work from home user. And so Forrester has seen 200% growth with zero trust alone. And has it been tested? Well, in short, probably not as much as we want it to be tested, right? There's very few environments that are 100% zero trust, if any. And so you've got these traditional defenses. And so if you're an adversary, why go through the hurdles of trying to get through a zero trust environment when you can use that soft, gooey middle and just get in there? Even if you have next generation capabilities, that doesn't provide zero trust. And so as a red teamer, the same thing applies. If you're testing an environment to see whether or not you can make your way in, the adversary is not going to take the hardest path inside the environment. They're going to take the easiest path. And so whether you have some elements of zero trust, you probably have areas that have the traditional defenses in place. And therefore, how tested is this environment? You've got to ask that question. The other thing that I think is critically important that isn't really talked about within zero trust is supply chain. We've seen this with SolarWinds, right? If you can get into the supply chain and now you have these applications or services running in this zero trust environment because they are trusted, I can wreak havoc. And so if you look at Kaseya, that's another example where there was 2 separate events that took place. The initial compromise was a result of a zero-day attack against the managed security service provider that enabled adversaries to conduct a service supply chain attack on additional victims. So the initial compromise appears to be a result of exploitation of an unpatched vulnerability, and it allowed the attackers to obtain privileged access to vulnerable software for the purposes of ransomware deployment. So here's a system that you have in your environment that now is behaving differently, maybe, right? But how do you detect that? You've made sure that the software that you deployed was trusted. You've got the access granted. It tries to reach out to some place, maybe to get some instructions. How do you stop that? And so this is where a lot of those complementary capabilities that exist in your environment today are going to help augment that zero trust outcome. So what are some of the impacts? Well, look at SolarWinds, for example. The Security Exchange Commission is investigating this hack, and corporate executives are fearful of information unearthed in this expanding probe will expose them to liability. Now, The good thing here is we're getting a spotlight on some of the breaches that are taking place because the impact is severe, whether that be critical infrastructure or humans themselves, like a hospital that's compromised and procedures or healthcare can't be provided. It's real. And now it's got a spotlight and government is getting involved here. So zero trust may help us with some of this. So the goal here ultimately is resetting with a capability-driven discussion and always aligning this to that zero trust framework. So we're going to walk through an example of this, but if you look at the diagrams that I have here, you can see a couple of use cases. One is work from home, obviously top of mind today with COVID. And the other is a campus email user that's connecting to that service. So they're connected on premise like a traditional connectivity model, and they're accessing an email services. Now, some of this may be the same. Some of this might be a little bit different in regards to the capabilities required to drive towards zero trust. And then you've got to think about some of the other elements to this: threat intelligence, threat hunting and incident response, orchestration and automation. You can't ignore these pieces because they become critically important in that life cycle of zero trust, right? If you see something connect to an environment and it's trusted at the moment it connects, and the disposition of that trust level changes to untrusted because they've opened a weaponized PDF, well, those are the complementary technologies that's going to feed that information into your zero trust framework that's going to tell the initial disposition that something has changed and therefore revoke access. Okay, let's dig into this a little bit deeper. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at the capabilities required to secure a flow. Forget zero trust for 1 second here. And so there's kind of two approaches. One is prevention. We want to prevent 100% of everything, which is not a reality. And that's where detect and response comes in. So we want to look at it from those two perspectives. And then what we'll do is start overlaying the zero trust capabilities on top of that. But it'll give us a sense of why these complementary capabilities are just as critical as those zero trust elements that we'll be adding. So you've got things like patching and exploit prevention. You've got advanced malware protection. You've got behavioral protection or malicious activity protection. So this is things like, malware starts to, or ransomware starts to encrypt a drive. Just based on that behavior or activity, I can mitigate risk. You've got application blocking, network blocking, USB blocking. You've got intrusion prevention. You've got firewalling. You've got fileless. So this is malware that might be running in memory and not on disk. And then you've got, some marketing terms around artificial intelligence, machine learning. Ideally, you just need something that understands what good should look like and what bad should look like. And the data set is continually being updated with new information, and it can use that to determine something that might align with unknown to determine, is it good or is it bad? So that's a preventative capability, right, across the board. And these may or may not exist on the endpoint. Doesn't really matter. If you're protecting at the endpoint, which you have to do, you can't get away from it. It's the place you don't want to prevent, right? Because if it's gotten this close to the asset, you have to be 100% correct or you're compromised. So you want to move those preventative capabilities as far upstream as possible. That way you've got an opportunity to block it at multiple layers. But once it gets to the endpoint, you have to be 100% correct. If not, you've been compromised. Then you've got detect and response capabilities. So endpoint detection response, understanding what's taking place on the asset. Forensics, you need forensics data. Host isolation, I need to isolate it whether you're on-prem or off-prem. I need to be able to make a decision if there's a high-level risk involved here with an incident that I can isolate and restrict access from that host. Cloud-based IOCs, so you certainly need intelligence coming from the cloud itself. Command line capture, I need to know that not only was PowerShell launched, but it was actually PowerCat -C, all the elements that are part of that command line argument. Sandboxing and file analysis. Now, I've kept that in the detect and response side because it's very difficult to do that live. So if you have an HTTP connection, you can't sandbox a file in time to get a disposition back before HTTP times out. So that's typically an after or a detect and response capability, not a preventative capability, although it will feed your preventative capability once the disposition has been determined. You need risk-based vulnerability insight. So the ability to not only understand that you're vulnerable, so you can do that system hygiene or patching that we mentioned on the preventative side, but we also need to understand the risk level of the particular vulnerability. Is there an exploit? Is it remote code executed? These are things that are going to make it easier for us to make a decision and prioritize what needs to be patched. Not everything needs to be patched, and not every vulnerability can be exploited. IP fix or flow correlation, so understanding every single transaction that comes out of the endpoint. So whether that's process, application, making a network-bound connection, I want to track 100% of everything. Not a subset, and endpoint detection response captures some of this, but it doesn't capture everything. IP fix at the endpoint can certainly provide that insight. Then we move into the network, right? We start leaving the endpoint. Again, some of these controls like IPS might be upstream. We've got somebody connecting to the network. So we want to authorize it and authenticate that asset. We want to do posture. We want to do dynamic control. Now, if you think of NIST 800-207, some of this stuff is starting to ring a bell here. Then you get denied authentications and device insight. So we want to know if you're denied access and what your device might have in regards to, is it a corporate asset you are connecting from? What is the posture level of the device? So just additional context so I can truly understand what's happening here. Then you do DNS lookup, and obviously there's an opportunity for security. You've got web proxy, DLP, TLS-based decryption. Again, this is critically important. TLS decryption needs to happen in today's world, or you're missing a large number of the attacks, because you can't run IPS and you can't run malware inspection if it's TLS encrypted. Advanced malware protection. Now you might ask, well, wait a minute, why are you mentioning advanced malware protection here when you mentioned it on the endpoint? Again, layers matter, and if I can block upstream, I'm better served than blocking at the asset that I'm trying to protect. Now, the detect and response side, you've got DNS forensics, full URI capture, sandbox and file analysis. And then we move on, more preventative capabilities like DDoS. Maybe that service is critically important to my business, so I want to make sure I'm preventing any denial of service attack. Obviously, then comes with analysis for that detect and response capability. Multi-factor authentication. So now, again, per session based authentication and authorization can take place here. So not only did I authenticate and authorize on the network before I accessed any service, I'm now doing it based on the service I'm connecting to. Endpoint posture, an opportunity. If the disposition has changed on the endpoint at any given point in time, I now have an opportunity to change my mind and not allow access to that application. Geo-based control. And then you get into things like device insight, denied authentications. And as we continue to move along, you get layer 7 firewalling. You get TLS-based decryption. You've got intrusion prevention. You've got advanced malware inspection. So again, it could be a different protocol being used here, not HTTP. So you want to make sure that you have the right capabilities to inspect the traffic that's being questioned here. And again, this shows that the payload may not be trusted, even though it may have been trusted from an asset and user perspective all the way up into the application itself. The payload coming out of the asset may be at risk of compromising a vulnerability in a supply chain attack. Correlation and behavioral-based policy. So the ability to have a little bit more complicated rule sets that provide better outcomes on understanding what might be happening. For example, if we have a C-suite individual accessing a resource that was just compromised or had an IOC triggered and is running a corporate asset or running a specific piece of software, all of those things are conditions to drive out a behavioral-based policy. And you can even do it from a packets per second or amount of throughput. Any changes in that environment that trigger a collection of items or attributes in policy to drive an alert or an outcome is going to be valuable. Then you get host profiling. Impact analysis. So again, impact analysis and host profiling kind of go together. So what that means is that I understand the asset and the context of the asset itself that made the connection, and I understand whether or not it may be at risk of being vulnerable and if there's an exploit in the wild. And so I can give it an impact score and again empower the analyst. Sandboxing again could be done from a network perspective. You got vulnerability insight, and then event packet capture. Again, forensically, we need this data, DNS, flow data, event packet capture. All of this is going to, malware samples, all of this is going to help us in any investigation that we might have to do. Event workflow, so the ability to drill down into an event and be able to drive a visual outcome of what really is happening in the environment, not just specifically on a specific capability, but feeding multiple different capabilities across my environment to enrich the overall data set that I'm investigating. Behavioral-based flow analytics, as I mentioned, if for example, you are compromised and all of a sudden an asset is now communicating a little bit differently than it has before because I baseline the environment, I'm able to detect that. That's a good example of maybe how you might detect a supply chain attack. All of a sudden you did an update to the actual software. There's something in that supply chain attack that now makes the application communicate differently than it did before. This is an opportunity here to detect that. You got web application firewalls. You got web application firewall analysis, reputation filtering, spam, business email compromise. Now we're getting into the service itself that we're connecting to, and it'll have its own wrapper wrapped around it to prevent and protect, and also allow us to build out that zero trust outcome or complement it. You got advanced malware, gray mail, phishing, URL protection, sandboxing. Now you might say, well, why is sandboxing here as a preventative capability, but in other areas it was a detect or response capability? Well, in email, we can hold the email long enough to wait for a disposition to get back when we sandbox a file. And therefore, it can be used as a preventative capability in this use case. DLP, and then you got some, detection response capability, message tracking, URL and file analysis. Then we get into application segmentation, blocking communications to indications of compromise. So this is at the application layer. So host-based micro-segmentation that's taking place here. Application visibility, forensics, and then you might also have some endpoint detection response capabilities on that service itself. Wow, right? There's a lot of capabilities to consider. So imagine just saying, here's zero trust, we're going to get zero trust. Well, if you ask me, the payload coming from the asset isn't trusted by any security or defender today. We don't trust it. That's why there's intrusion prevention. Should it be part of your zero trust outcome? Should it feed information back in to make sure that we're mitigating any risk that we might see there? Absolutely. So now that we've got this flow, we're going to do this for all the flows in the organization. And so this is going to take some time. You should do this regardless. It's very hard to defend based on a product pitch versus truly understanding what's required in order to secure a flow. Once you understand this and understand the capabilities, you can go to market at that point in time and figure out what product helps achieve the outcome that you're driving towards here. And again, this could be plus or minus capabilities, but it gives you a good idea of what might be required. Now, when we zoom in a little bit, let's think about zero trust and the elements that support that. So when you connect, whether it's VPN, wired, or wireless, you have the opportunity to authenticate and authorize. You have the ability to do dynamic-based control, only give the access required for that particular asset. When I say asset, I'm talking about context of the machine and the user. You also have the ability to do it when you access resources from a multi-factor authentication perspective, adding that layered approach to ensuring that username and passwords, if compromised, are mitigated with a second factor. You've got endpoint posture in some geo-based controls. And then on the application side, you need to understand how the application needs to communicate, what ports and protocols are leveraged in order for the service to be operational. Once you do that, then you can now micro-segment the application itself and restrict access. So if something does happen to that asset, it's restricted in what it can communicate with. So only allow what is required to communicate with it. But you can see there's a bunch of other stuff in there that didn't fall in line with the core zero trust elements outside of being complementary to them. Then you've got threat intelligence, you've got threat hunting and incident response, and then orchestration and automation. So complexity is the enemy of security. And you can see that as you drive towards zero trust, it can get complicated very, very quickly, especially when vendors are saying 10% more here, buy us, and you are fully zero trust capable at this point in time, which we know is not factual. There's other elements to consider here. So the question now becomes, how many products? What about the cloud? What about remote users, right? Remember those other flows that I have to analyze. I've got data center services and much more. And so now I've got, the ability to do contextual awareness, postures assessed, machine and user-based authentication and authorization, dynamic control, and software-defined access or microsegmentation. There's one checkbox, right? We know that aligns to NIST 800-207. We also get primary authentication is taken care of with our traditional mechanisms, but we add multi-factor authentication. We get endpoint posture and health, and we get location assessed here as well based on application access. And then the application itself, we understand the applications, how it communicates, both application and all the sub-processes that are involved. And we get into host-based microsegmentation as well from a services lens perspective. So let's go through this to put some perspective on zero trust and why zero trust alone is not going to achieve 100% security. If we had that SolarWinds attack that was deployed on that asset, well, we were at risk. It was trusted application. It did have access. It met all the requirements. It just happens to be that the DLL was compromised during an update or regular patching that we may have done to make sure system hygiene is at the highest level. But in fact, we've opened the door. And so we've got a compromised asset. Now, if we had microsegmentation done here, there's a good chance that maybe the communication out from that particular asset has been restricted. Maybe not. Maybe it can access outbound 443 to access, call home or whatever mechanism it might be. And so there's some risk there. You have a user that clicks on a high risk web link. Again, they connected to the campus environment. They've authenticated. We've done endpoint posture. We've authenticated to the service with multi-factor. We've done posture again or reassessed it. We've got application control, but they access a high-risk web link and get compromised on the endpoint. That disposition has changed, right? That asset's not as trustworthy as it is. And the zero trust elements or the core elements is not going to detect that. It's going to be those extra capabilities that we've used traditionally in our environment to secure them. And then you've got a payload that might come from that asset to compromise the service. So it's crafted. Again, what's going to detect that? Well, zero trust isn't necessarily going to catch that, right? Again, I've already authenticated to the service, to the network, the application's restricted. I'm now taking advantage of a vulnerability that may exist on that asset, and I'm going to compromise it with a crafted payload. So I need intrusion prevention as an example here to be able to catch something like this. So again, those complementary technologies are core in the success of zero trust. So we need to extend the security capabilities to help achieve and maintain zero trust. So this includes system hygiene, endpoint security, DNS security, web proxy, TLS decryption, intrusion prevention, security intelligence, reputation insight, behavioral analytics, process protection, and more, right? The point being here is that zero trust is much broader than a couple of products. So the goal with zero trust is ultimately to reduce the overall blast radius. So if I did get compromised or I did compromise that service with a crafted payload, I'm hoping that zero trust will minimize the ability for the adversary to move laterally within the environment or compromise additional assets in that environment. So let's look at this from a Cisco lens perspective. So we've got software-defined access. This is for the workplace. Establish least privileged access control for all users and devices, including IoT, accessing your network. Secure access for the workforce. Establish trust level for users and their devices, accessing applications and resources. And finally, secure workload. Restrict access to workloads based on risk, contextual policy, and verified business need. Now look how this aligns. You can see the yellow elements aligned to each one of these capabilities within the Cisco security framework when it comes to zero trust. The other really neat thing is Cisco can also help complement the other areas that help drive towards zero trust.
And as your trusted partner, we'll be there to help every step of the way.